You know, some memories never really leave you. They settle somewhere deep inside, like quiet echoes that come alive when you least expect it. Today's story is one of those memories, something that changed the way I see kindness and courage forever. But before I begin, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It all began one gray afternoon years ago when I still lived in that small cul-de-sac with the leaning oak tree at the corner. The kind of neighborhood where everyone waved but didn't really talk much beyond polite hellos. I was in my late 40s then, newly divorced, adjusting to a quieter house and a slower rhythm. The silence had a way of pressing on me, especially around dusk when the sun fell behind the roofs and the street turned to amber. My next-door neighbor, Mark, lived there with his son, Daniel. Daniel was about 11 at the time, thin, with those scruffy bangs always hanging in his eyes and a curiosity that seemed to follow him everywhere. I used to see him riding his bike in circles around the mailbox, sometimes humming to himself. Mark worked long hours, and I often noticed Daniel sitting alone on their porch steps, sketching in a little notebook. One afternoon, while trimming my front hedge, I heard a small voice behind me say, "You missed a spot." I turned, and there he was, Daniel, with his notebook tucked under his arm, a crooked grin on his face. His tone was playful, not rude, so I played along. "Oh, really? You plan to fix it for me?" He shrugged. "I could, but then you wouldn't get better." It made me laugh, the way kids could toss wisdom around without even knowing it. He stayed a while, asking about the flowers, about why I liked lilacs more than roses, and before long, I found myself telling him stories about my childhood garden. It was easy to talk to him. He listened, really listened, something many adults forget how to do. Over the weeks, Daniel started dropping by more often. Sometimes he'd help me carry groceries, sometimes just sit on the porch and sketch while I painted small wooden signs for my garden. It was innocent, simple, the kind of companionship that felt pure and unexpected. But there was something else too, a quiet understanding between us. Maybe because we both knew a bit about loneliness. One evening, I noticed he seemed quieter than usual. His sketchpad lay untouched beside him. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of the neighbor's barbecue. I asked if something was wrong, and after a long silence, he said, "Dad doesn't talk much anymore. He's always tired. Sometimes I think he forgets I'm even here." His voice cracked, and I could see the effort it took for him to keep steady. I wanted to say something wise, something comforting, but all I managed was, "Sometimes grown-ups get lost in their own storms, Daniel. It's not that they forget, they just don't know how to come back right away." He nodded, staring at the sunset, his hands clasped around his knees. Then, in that small, quiet moment, he looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. "You don't talk like you're lost." I didn't know what to say. His words were simple, but they went straight through me. For months I had been pretending that I was fine, that my divorce hadn't shaken the ground beneath me, that I wasn't still waking up some mornings unsure of who I was supposed to be. And yet this boy, with his skinned knees and ink-stained fingers, saw right through it. We sat there until the sky turned violet and the first streetlight blinked on. The world felt quieter, lighter somehow. When he finally stood to go, he gave a small wave and said, "See you tomorrow, Miss Helen." After he left, I sat for a long time on that porch. The cicadas had started their nightly chorus, and the air felt thick and warm. I realized then that sometimes strength doesn't come from grand gestures or big moments. Sometimes it comes from a child's simple words, spoken without agenda, words that remind you that you're still capable of being seen, of being whole. That night before bed, I opened an old journal I hadn't touched in months. I wrote down his words. "You don't talk like you're lost." They became my quiet mantra, something I whispered to myself on the harder days. I didn't know then how much those words, and that boy, would come to mean in the years ahead. But looking back now, that was the moment everything started to change. The following weeks carried a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood, once just a backdrop of fences and familiar driveways, began to feel alive again. Mornings came easier. I'd make coffee and watch the street come to life, waiting for that little knock on my porch railing. Daniel's way of saying hello without saying it. He'd show up before school, backpack slung over one shoulder, his hair sticking up in a dozen directions. Sometimes we'd sit quietly, both of us half awake, just listening to the world wake up. The low hum of cars, the distant bark of a dog, the faint creak of the old oak swaying at the corner. He always had a new drawing to show me, and though I didn't know much about art, I made sure to look closely, to ask him what he saw in each line and color. It made him light up every time. One morning he drew my garden. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were a little off, and my lilacs looked more like purple clouds, but he'd captured something in it I couldn't name. When I asked what he thought of it, he said, "It's how it feels when I'm here." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. As autumn settled in, the days grew shorter, and our little porch talks turned into warm cocoa evenings. His dad, Mark, had started noticing too. He'd wave more often, sometimes stopping by to chat about the weather or ask for a favor, always polite but distant, like someone who wanted to connect but wasn't sure how. There was weariness in his eyes, the kind that comes from holding too much together for too long. One evening, after Daniel had gone inside, Mark came over carrying a box of old light bulbs. "You wouldn't happen to know how to make these things last, would you?" he asked with a tired grin. I laughed, telling him I wasn't a magician. We ended up talking for nearly an hour, about work, about how hard it was raising a kid alone, about how quiet nights could sometimes feel louder than they should. When he left, I realized how much I'd missed simple conversation. Not the polite kind, but real talk, the kind that leaves you thinking afterward. Days slipped by, and one chilly afternoon, I noticed Daniel wasn't on the porch after school. I thought maybe he had homework or a play date, but when 2 days passed without a sign of him, I started to worry. Finally, I saw Mark in the driveway and asked. His face fell. "He's been a little sick. Nothing serious, just a cold. I've been keeping him in." Later that evening, I baked a small loaf of banana bread and brought it over, wrapped in a towel still warm from the oven. Daniel answered the door in a hoodie too big for him, his cheeks flushed, but his smile the same. "Thought you might need some extra energy," I said, handing him the bread. He laughed softly, then asked, "Did you still take care of the garden today?" I nodded. "The lilacs missed your smart comments." He smiled again, that shy, knowing smile of his, and said something that stayed with me for a long time. "They'll bloom better next year. Things do that, you know. They rest first." It struck me how matter-of-fact he was about it, how he said it like he'd seen it proven 100 times before. I stood there, nodding, trying not to show how much that small truth touched me. Because maybe that was what I'd been doing too. Resting, waiting to bloom again after losing so much. When spring returned, Daniel was back to his old self, zipping around the street on his bike, waving at every neighbor as if the world belonged to him. He'd stop by to tell me about school, or show me how much taller he'd grown since the winter. And though life went on, as it always does, something inside me had shifted. He had reminded me, without meaning to, that hope often hides in small moments. In laughter between generations, in shared silence on a porch, in a boy's quiet wisdom that life, like lilacs, knows how to heal itself in its own time. That year, the lilacs bloomed brighter than I could remember, and every time I walked past them, I thought of Daniel's words, That gentle reminder that resting doesn't mean giving up. It means getting ready. I didn't know then that another storm was waiting for both of us, something that would test that lesson in ways I could never have imagined. But I'd soon learn that even the smallest voices can leave echoes strong enough to carry you through the hardest days. The storm came quietly at first, like most changes do. It began with little signs: the way Mark's truck stayed in the driveway longer each morning, how Daniel stopped by less often, and how their house, once filled with small noises, laughter, the clatter of a basketball, the hum of cartoons through the window, grew silent. It was late summer by then, the air thick and heavy, the kind of weather that makes time feel slower. I remember standing by my kitchen sink, watering a pot of basil, when I saw Daniel sitting alone on his front steps again. His shoulders were slumped, his hands clasped tight. Something in the stillness of his small frame pulled me outside. When I reached him, he didn't look up right away. Finally, he said, "Dad lost his job." The words came out small, like he'd been carrying them too long. I sat down beside him. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, filling the silence that neither of us knew how to break. "That's hard," I said quietly. "Is he okay?" He shrugged. "He says he will be, but he's been different. He doesn't eat much. He just stares at his computer all day." He hesitated, then added, "I think he's sad." I could hear the worry in his voice, that helpless kind of worry children feel when they see adults unravel and don't know how to fix it. I told him sometimes grown-ups forget they can ask for help. They think they have to carry everything alone. Daniel glanced at me then, his eyes searching mine. "You don't carry things alone," he said. "You let people in." That stopped me cold, because in truth, I hadn't always been that way. It had taken me years to open my doors again, to let anyone see the mess, the cracks, the softer parts I used to hide. But somehow, he'd noticed. I smiled and said, "Maybe you could remind your dad of that." The next morning, I saw Mark mowing the lawn. He waved, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. I walked over, offered him some lemonade, and we talked for a while. He admitted it had been rough, losing his job, worrying about bills, trying to stay strong for Daniel. He said, "I don't want him to see me as weak." I told him the truth. "He doesn't see you as weak, Mark. He sees you as his dad. That's what matters most." Something in his expression softened, like a weight had shifted just slightly off his shoulders. Before he went back inside, he said, "Thanks, Helen, for being there for him and for us." That evening, Daniel came by with a folded piece of paper. "It's for you," he said shyly. When I unfolded it, I found a sketch of 3 lilac bushes, mine, his, and one small new one between them. Underneath, he'd written, "Things grow better when they're not alone." My throat tightened. I told him it was beautiful, but the truth was, it was more than that. It was a message I hadn't realized I needed. As summer waned into fall, our little trio found a rhythm. I helped Mark look over job applications, and Daniel often joined me in the garden after school. We didn't talk about their struggles much. Instead, we talked about life, the things that still made us laugh, the little victories. One day, Mark got a call for an interview, and I could hear his relief even through the walls. A week later, he knocked on my door, beaming. "I got the job," he said. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Daniel was beside him, grinning from ear to ear. "Told you things would bloom again," he said, echoing his own words from so long ago. That night, I sat alone on my porch, the stars scattered bright across the sky. The air had that crisp promise of change. I thought about how life weaves people into our stories at the exact moment we need them, sometimes through loss, sometimes through laughter, sometimes through the simple act of showing up for each other. And I realized that this connection, between neighbors, between hearts that refused to give up, was what had quietly rebuilt me. Still, I didn't know that another test of strength was coming, one that would remind me once more how fragile and precious our days can be. But when it arrived, it was Daniel's words, those simple, steadfast words, that would carry me through. It was the first winter in years that truly felt cold, not the kind of cold you shake off with a blanket and tea, but the kind that settles deep into your bones, the kind that makes you remember how fragile warmth can be. The snow came early that year. It blanketed our little street in quiet, soft white. The trees stood still, the houses tucked in under their roofs like resting animals. I'd grown used to Daniel's knock on my porch railing, but as December settled in, that sound came less often. School had been keeping him busy, Mark said, and the shorter days seemed to pull everyone inside earlier. Then one evening, just a few days before Christmas, I heard the knock again. 3 soft taps. I opened the door to find Daniel standing there in a puffy coat, his breath rising in small clouds. He held something wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," he said. "Dad helped me a little." I smiled and took it from him. Inside was a framed drawing, the same lilacs he'd drawn months ago, only now the sketch had color. He'd added birds and the porch, and in the corner, a woman sitting on the steps, a boy beside her, both looking toward the horizon. "It's us," he said quietly. I looked at him, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The drawing wasn't just a picture. It was a memory, our memory, captured in his steady hand. I set it down carefully on the table, then told him, "It's perfect, Daniel. Absolutely perfect." We had cocoa that night, talking about the year gone by. He told me about school, about how his dad had been doing better, and how they might visit his grandparents come spring. There was light in his voice again, that same bright energy I'd seen the first day we met. When he left, he waved and said, "See you soon, Miss Helen." But soon stretched longer than either of us expected. A week later, Mark stopped by alone. His face was pale, his eyes tired. "Daniel's in the hospital," he said quietly. "Pneumonia. It hit him fast." The world seemed to tilt. My porch, my garden, the air. Everything blurred for a second. I visited the next morning. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and faint hope. Daniel was small in that big bed, tubes and monitors all around him. But when he saw me, his eyes brightened. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Your lilacs still need you to boss them around, you know." He smiled faintly. "They'll be okay. You'll make sure." Those days were heavy and slow. Mark hardly left his side, and I brought meals, small comforts, anything that might help. We took turns reading to him, talking about everything except sickness. He liked hearing about the garden, about how the snow looked when the moonlight hit it just right. Then, one morning, the doctor said he was improving. Slowly, yes, but improving. Relief washed over all of us like sunlight after days of rain. When Daniel was finally well enough to come home, the whole neighborhood came out to welcome him. There were balloons, hot cocoa, and laughter echoing down the street. That night, after everyone had gone inside, Daniel and I sat once more on my porch steps. The air was cold, but the stars seemed close enough to touch. He leaned his head against my shoulder, something he hadn't done since he was younger. "You know what I realized?" he said softly. "Sometimes when things get really bad, people come closer. Like all the walls disappear for a while." I looked at him, this boy who had somehow grown wiser than most adults I knew, and said, "You're right, Daniel. That's when we see what matters." He nodded. "That's when we see who matters." And there it was again, those simple words, carrying more truth than he probably knew. The years passed, as they always do. Daniel grew taller, his voice deeper, his sketches sharper. He went off to college, came back during summers, always stopping by with new drawings, new stories, the same warmth in his smile. Mark eventually remarried, and the house next door filled with laughter again. As for me, I grew older, as we all must, but not in the same lonely way I once feared. My garden still blooms every spring, and that framed drawing of the lilacs hangs right above my kitchen table. Sometimes, when the morning light hits it just right, the colors seem alive. And every time I see it, I hear his voice again, that young, steady voice saying, "You don't talk like you're lost." He was right. I'm not. Not anymore. Because sometimes the smallest souls cross our paths and remind us who we are, not through grand gestures or long speeches, but through a few simple, honest words that settle deep and never fade. And so, to everyone listening tonight, wherever you are, I hope you find your own version of that light. Someone or something that brings you strength when the days grow quiet. Now, before you go, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe for more moments that remind us.